All right. Good afternoon, um, and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, and have the good fortune to help host a lot of the Iowa Learning Farms webinar. And I'm really excited about this one because it's something I know very little about. And so I'm going to learn something today, along with probably many of you as well. We have Dr. Kate Borchardt, that's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And she's going to talk to us today about debunking wasp pollination. And with that, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Dr. Borchardt at the end of the talk. And with that, Dr. Borchardt, the virtual floor is all yours.
Hi, well, yeah, thanks for having me. Um, and yeah, I'll be talking about my research with wasp pollination today. So, as many of us are aware, there's multiple groups of insect pollinators. We might be familiar with more charismatic groups such as bees and butterflies, but other groups of insect pollinators include moths, beetles, flies, and wasps, which will be the focus of today's talk. And among these different insect groups, there's different public perceptions about them. And you might have groups such as the bees and butterflies that are viewed very positively, associated with words such as honey, endangered, beautiful, delicate, colorful, and all those kinds of positive connotation words. But other groups, such as wasps and flies, might have more negative connotations. They might be associated with annoying, dirty, stinging, buzz, dirt, yeah. They might be more negatively viewed. And this then affects what is known about these pollinator groups. But one thing that I would like to state, so if you like bees, you already like wasps. And this is because bees and wasps and ants all belong to the order Hymenoptera. And evolutionarily, the bees and ants are contained under the umbrella of wasps. You have ants over here, kind of branching off to one side, and bees over here branching off to the other side. So I like to think of bees as the fuzzy vegetarian wasps, but they are, in fact, wasps. So if you like bees, you're already halfway there to liking all the rest of wasps. And wasps contribute beneficial ecosystem services to human society. And so ecosystem services are ways that ecosystems benefit human society both directly and indirectly. And in the case of wasps, this might be through pollination services, but also through plant herbivore regulation. So they prey on pest organisms, and that can then affect the plant communities. If we do this in more of an agricultural context, that means that wasps can contribute to cross yield and quality, but also pest management because they prey on groups such as caterpillars, beetles, and flies. And the main study I could find that specifically looked at the pest management services of WASP estimated that they contribute about $800 billion to the agricultural economy as of 2024 for accounting for inflation. So they are also very important. Now, for pollination, we often focus a lot on bees, and here you can see across many different crop species here on the bottom axis, and the proportion of visits from different pollinator groups. All of this blue is bee visitation, but you can see that there's a lot of non-bee visitation to these crop plants as well. And this is to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt because, like I said, the perception of some of these groups can be negative, and this can translate to the amount of research we have on these different groups. So looking just at bees and wasps, bees have a more positive public perception than their close relatives, the wasps, from members of the public. And if we look then at the number of studies published focusing on either bees and wasps, the number of studies published on wasps is lower than the number of studies on bees. So while there is some research on some of these non-bee groups, we are still kind of determining the contribution of these non-bee pollinators. This graph was created based on already published research. If there is less research to these non-bee groups, then we don't actually quite know how much they're contributing to some of these crop species. And so this contribution might be much higher than we currently understand. And this kind of led me to what I wanted to study, which is why wasps tend to not be perceived as good pollinators. And this is often based off of these historical assumptions of wasp pollination. And I say assumptions because when I was researching this topic, there wasn't a lot of data backing up some of these claims. And so part of this project was to take these assumptions, collect some data, and see whether they held up to the data that we were collecting, whether they were actually true. And so I'm going to go through 3 different assumptions, show you what we found, and kind of build up some evidence for wasp pollination. And so the first assumption is that wasps aren't loyal flower visitors. And this is built off of the fact that unlike bees who collect both nectar and pollen from plants, wasps only really forage for nectar. And so this is their carbohydrate source, their main source of energy, but that's only one aspect of all of their nutrition. And nectar tends to only contain carbohydrates, so it's not quite it doesn't have many components like the amount of lipids, the amount of amino acids, different combinations of those that you might need to consider. So the basic assumption for this is that they're very generalized. They're just going to visit whatever flower is most available, collect nectar, and they're not going to be very picky. But for plant pollination, you want pollen to be transferred from one individual to another individual of the same plant species in order to pollinate the plant and produce seeds or fruit. So we wanted to see what plants are wasps actually visiting. And to do this, we looked at their plant community use, and I'm going to show some graphs. And how you read these graphs is if there's similar plant community being used, there's going to be some overlapping regions between the wasp family shown in this blue color and the bee family shown in this pink color. And if there's different plant communities being used, there's going to be little to no overlap between the shapes. And this is also going to be supported by some statistical measures such as R-squared and p-values. So overall, wasps and bees were using different communities. You see there's a little bit of overlap, but overall these shapes are quite different in terms of what composition of plants they're visiting. But we wanted to break this down a little bit based off of what time of the season we were measuring. So whether it was early spring into early summer or kind of late summer into fall. Also, what type of environment? So weedy environments such as, unmaintained field edges versus habitat that was planted with native prairie plants. And what we found is that in the early season, we found a different plant community being used as well as in weedy environments. So that means that bees and wasps were generally visiting different plant species during these 2 situations. But this can indicate that wasps might play a unique role in pollination in these circumstances because they're visiting plants less visited by bees, that they might be contributing to pollination of these plants in the absence of bees and be important for their pollination. Now, for the late season and native habitat, we found much more similar plant community use. And this shows some sort of redundancy and that wasps might be very important for native plants, particularly in the native habitat. And redundancy as being if we have some sort of loss of bees in the community, then wasps can step in and help pollinate these plants that they are also visiting. And so this assumption that they're not loyal flower visitors can be instead interpreted that wasps can be important pollinators of native plants. They can be visiting plants that are less visited by bees, and they do seem to have their own special community of plants that they visit, and they don't just generally visit all plants in these systems. And so the next assumption is that wasps don't carry enough pollen on their body to sufficiently transfer pollen between plant individuals. And this is based off of different traits belonging to both wasps and bees. For bees, they have denser, they look a lot fuzzier. They have specialized hairs. It actually looks like they have a lot of split ends under the microscope, and this helps them kind of retain pollen better. Whereas wasps tend to have less hair, they don't have those split ends, so they don't have specialized hair to kind of retain pollen. In addition, bees are actively collecting pollen as their protein source, and so they're going to have more pollen on their bodies. They tend to carry it externally, such as this bumblebee. You can see its little pollen sacs on its hind leg. This could then, transfer to a plant and help pollinate it. Wasps don't do this. They use prey for their protein source, so they're not actively collecting it. They won't have an abundance of pollen on their bodies. However, since bees are actively collecting it, this pollen that they're collecting might be used more for bee consumption rather than pollinating plants. Right? There's kind of a conflict of interest between the bees wanting to collect pollen for their own use and keep and contain it, not lose it as they're flying around in a way that might contribute to plant pollination. And we can see this a little more clearly if we look at the differences between the two sexes for solitary bees itself. And so looking at female and male bees of solitary species, so solitary species, they don't live in big colonies. They just live kind of on their own. And the different roles are that female bees collect pollen for the larva, so they're collecting the resources, they're building the nest, they're laying the eggs. Whereas male bees generally just forage for themselves and seek out mates, and they don't contribute as much to creating the nest and collecting the resources. So between these, if we look at how much pollen they're removing from a plant in a single visit, we see that female bees are removing a lot more pollen grains than male bees in a single visit. So they're taking more pollen away that can then be used for pollination. However, when they are visiting a plant and depositing pollen grains, so contributing to pollination, you have to deposit the pollen grains so that seeds can be fertilized. We see the opposite, where male bees are actually depositing more pollen grains in a single visit than female bees. So in fact, what we see is that female bees are removing more pollen, depositing less on other flowers, so not quite pollinating very effectively, whereas male bees are removing less pollen and depositing more on other flowers. So there are cases where, actively collecting pollen actually isn't very beneficial for the plant itself and contributing to the amount of seeds and fruit the plant is going to produce. So that brings us to the question of, do wasps have similar amounts of pollen on their body compared to bees? And we looked at this in two different ways. One was looking at how many pollen grains were on their body overall. And so with the number of grains on their body on the y-axis. We looked at this by bee and wasp family, with wasp families in that blue color and bee families in that pink color. And what we found is that the 4 of the 5 bee families had significantly higher pollen grains on their body than any of the other wasp families. But we're going to zoom in a little bit more on this lower group over here. And what we see here is that 2 wasp families had less pollen grains on their body than any bee family, but 2 wasp families had very similar pollen densities to the bee family Coletidae. And 2 wasp families actually had significantly more pollen on their bodies than that bee family Coletidae. And so thinking about that bee family, 92% of our specimens came from the genus Hylaeus. They actually carry pollen internally. So unlike other bees that store their pollen on their hind legs or under their abdomen, they carry it in their gut. And so perhaps that's why they seem much more similar to wasps in how much pollen is on the outside of their body. And then we also looked at visit fidelity. So this is, we observed the pollinator visiting a particular plant species, how many grains on the outside of its body belonged to that plant species that could, pollinate the plant species we observed it visiting. And what we see is that there was a lot more similarity in this metric. We have 3 wasp families that had significantly lower visit fidelity than any bee families, but 2 wasp families were similar to the bee family Coletidae from the previous graph, as well as the bee family Megachilidae, which is the leafcutter bees. We had 2 wasp families that were similar in visit fidelity to the family Apidae, which includes bumblebees and honeybees, and 1 wasp family that was similar to the bee family Andrenidae, which is the mining bees, and only the bee family Halictidae, which is our sweat bees, had significantly higher visit fidelity than any of the other wasp families. So overall, this assumption that wasps don't carry enough pollen on their body, well, actually, they have very similar pollen compositions to bees. While they might carry less pollen overall, they do have the right grains to pollinate the plants that they're visiting. And so both of these assumptions lead us then to the last one, which is that overall, wasps will not cause sufficient pollen deposition. They won't carry enough pollen grains to the correct place on the plant to cause pollination. And so to study this, we did a targeted study focusing on the northern paper wasp Polycis fiscatus and the common eastern bumblebee Bombus impatiens, and how much pollen it deposited in a single visit on the plant complex Solidago canadensis, which is the Canadian goldenrod. And this was a very novel study because single visit deposition studies, the amount of pollen they deposit in a single visit, is rather difficult to do in wasps because they switch between foraging for nectar for their own adult energy needs, as well as searching for prey to, provide for their nest and their offspring. So how we did this is we set up wasp nests in a meshed hoop house, kind of like a greenhouse, just with mesh siding. And we gave them floral resources at a particular location where they could learn that this is the location to go to when I want to collect floral resources. And this then allowed us to then swap out different plant groups for our study and get reliable wasp visitation when we wanted it to occur. So this opens the door for a lot more studies in the future with other plant species. But for this part of the experiment, we had 5 different groups of flowers, and all of them were bagged from the bud stage to ensure that no insects had visited these flowers prior to being used in their respective treatment groups. and one of the groups was always bagged, so it was never visited by an insect pollinator. One group was left open, so it was freely visited multiple times by pollinators. These were our two kind of control groups. And then the other three groups allowed for a single visit from different pollinator groups. One being a single visit from the bumblebee, Bombus impatiens, one being a single visit from female paper wasps, and one being a single visit from male paper wasps, because females and males might have different interactions with the plants. And then after these visitations occurred, we counted the number of pollen grains belonging to Solidago that were attached to the stigmas, which is the female reproductive region of the plant. So how many pollen grains could contribute then to seed set and pollination? And what we found, so again, on the bottom axis, we have visits from bumblebees, visits from the female wasps, and visits from the male wasps. And what we found is they actually left very similar amounts of pollen on the stigmas. There wasn't a significant difference between the bumblebees and both wasp groups. So paper wasps were just as efficient as bumblebees in pollinating the Canadian goldenrod in this instance. So will they cause sufficient pollen deposition? Well, it seems like they can, in this one study that we did, but hopefully we can continue to do this methodology on other plant groups as well. So overall conclusions, wasps do fit in the spectrum of bee pollination and different bee groups and how, what plants they visit, how much pollen they're carrying on their bodies, etc. And wasps might actually fulfill a special pollination niche. They're not visiting the exact same plants as bees. So they might be contributing to pollination of plants that are not getting bee pollination services. And more research is needed. Wasps are generally less studied than their close relatives, the bees. And using this methodology for single visit deposition is really important because it more directly correlates to actual plant pollination. So more research is needed. And then kind of a general note, I know that wasps can kind of be seen as a pest. They tend to build their colonies right next to your door or under your porch or places we generally don't want them to be. But they are very important for our ecosystems, and it's possible to coexist with these important creatures. And one way is to use the annual life cycle of the wasps themselves. So wasp nests are annual. They only last for a single year, with the queens overwintering, starting a new nest, that population then building up to its peak kind of in the late summer into fall. And then in winter, only the queens overwinter and the rest of the wasps die in their natural life cycle, and that repeats the next year. So the best way to coexist with wasps is in the early spring, right around now. If you notice any nests that are in high traffic areas, this is a great time to remove them when only the queens are kind of active on the nest. There's less wasps to deal with. If you remove the nest, then the queens can go try to build the nest in a more suitable location. But most people don't really notice wasps this early when they're such low populations. So if you notice the wasp nests kind of in that late summer into fall period, if you can find a way to coexist with them until winter, the nest will, complete its life cycle, naturally die off, and you can allow these creatures to live their lives out and contribute to our ecosystems. And so that's what I have prepared for everyone, and I'll take questions, but there's some other slides that we'll go through while we wait for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Borchardt. Yep, I will get these last logistical ones. If you have watched this webinar live and are wanting to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today, including your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. We can go to the next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out the voluntary demographic survey, we would greatly appreciate it. Only one survey is needed for 2025 webinars. So if you've done it, thank you so very much. And if you're willing to, we would greatly appreciate it. You can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. We can go to the next slide. And all right, we're going to have a couple of folks from the University of Wisconsin-Madison talking to us about using data to understand farmers' sustainability journeys. Next week, tune in next week, same time, same place. And then I think we have one more slide, which should be if you want to let somebody else know about this webinar, it will be archived at the iowalearningfarms.org/webinar survey or webinar, iowalearningfarms.org/webinars website, or you can go to the YouTube channel. We have an Iowa Learning Farms webinars YouTube channel and subscribe to that. So, all right, Kate, we have got some questions in here, and I'm going to ask the first one because it's the same question I had. I was fascinated when you started talking about, the pollen grains on the plants. How did you count those pollen grains, or how did you measure the pollen grains in your study?
We would collect the flowers of goldenrod are actually very, very small, maybe like the size of a pencil eraser. And well, that's actually a cluster of flowers. So we would collect some of these clusters, bring them back to the lab, dissect them, and then put them on a microscope and literally just count the grains that were attached to the stigma.
That had to be tedious work.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay, here's another one. Do wasps and bees get along?
There are some cases of aggression, and this is like there's aggression between other bee species, there's aggression between bees and other insect groups. So there can be some competition, especially socially at the end of fall. You have a lot of like honeybees and bumblebees and social wasps robbing each other's nests. But yeah, overall, not any more competition than bees have within their own group.
Okay,
Um, so
interesting.
they're
All right.
not overly aggressive
Over.
to the
Okay.
bees.
Okay. Another one. I wondered the same thing. Where do the queens overwinter?
It depends on the group, but generally, they all overwinter, just they build little burrows into the ground
Okay.
and overwinter under some layer of soil.
Okay. And do they, I guess, um, are they pretty susceptible to temperature? So if we have a really cold winter with low snow cover, that they might be more negatively impacted?
That's a great question. I haven't looked into the cold so much.
Okay.
I know that there's a lot of issues with like if we have a really warm, early spring snap and then it gets cold again,
Okay.
because if it's really warm for like a week, some of the queens might emerge. And this is the same
Oh,
for wasps and bees. And then if you have the cold snap, they'll be affected by that because they've already kind of woken up from their hibernation.
okay. All right. Great. Learned something new. All right. What do you think about European hornets that they've seen preying on paper wasps?
Um, Yeah, we do have some invasive hornets. We have some invasive paper wasps as well. I know that once they become established, it's very hard to get rid of them. There's been a lot of efforts on the Asian giant hornet that has come in that tends to prey on honeybee colonies and others. in particular, but it's good to try to contain it while there's still low populations, but once they establish, it's a little more difficult um, to maintain, but the ecosystem will attempt to kind of even out once they become established.
Okay. Um, are Asian wasps eating monarch butterflies?
Um, I think for the Asian giant hornet, they tend to go more for like the social bees. They
Okay.
they will invade like say a whole honeybee nest.
Oh, wow.
And in Asia, you have the Asian honeybee, and they have their own adaptive strategy to fend off their nests. But the Western honeybee, which is the kind that we often see here in the US, they don't have that mechanism. They haven't evolved it. So it can be very devastating when the Asian giant hornet does infiltrate a honeybee
Okay.
colony. It will just wipe it all out.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I think they tend to go for social organisms a little bit more than solitary, say, monarch butterflies.
Okay. How can one identify male versus female wasps?
Ooh, that's a good one. It does depend a lot on the species, but they tend to be actually pretty different. So paper wasps in particular, they can actually recognize faces of other wasps. They know which individual is which. And so the facial patterns is really important to them. And males tend to have much more yellow faces than the females. So those are really easy to tell apart. And it's also fun because for both bees and wasps, males can't sting. So there's some very non-aggressive bees or wasps that you can literally just hold in your hand. They can't sting you. They just kind of, they're fun to pet and play with a little.
Okay. All right. Oh, you just have to know which ones they are so you don't, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Is, is there any significant risk posed to fellow pollinators by aggressive behavior of wasps that would offset the pollination activity of those species if the wasps are let alone to do their own pollinator work?
I don't think so. Like if we're just focusing on the native wasps, they don't really they're not really aggressive towards the native pollinators. Yeah, if they both land on a flower, they might fight a little and one might fly away, but they don't actively kill the other bees. Like I
Okay.
said, that there's some robbing at the end of the season that happens with both bumblebees and wasps and honeybees. Of course, honeybees are more managed here. But these colonies are also annual, so there's fighting between the workers that are going to die off anyway. And again, this is just how these organisms evolved and this community evolved. So this is its natural state. And while we might kind of view some of these as aggressive, it's not it's not unusual for how this community normally functions.
All right. Another one. Wasps being a generalist, would they overlap with plants that bees exclusively use in the spring or weedy plant communities if bees were not in the area? Or are there certain plants that have features or deterrents that ward off wasps?
Um, I would say that wasps probably do have certain features that they might prefer over bees. I know wasps tend to visit kind of like open flowers, say like a sunflower or like the
Okay.
top of Queen Anne's lace. It's like really easy to access. You just land and you visit the flowers. Um, so there might be a little bit of a preference to different plant traits that are different than bees. Um, like I said, that if wasps and bees are visiting similar plants, then there is a redundancy. So if we lose bees in that community, wasps can be there to kind of pick up some of the pollination services from those lost bees. And I think I'm missing one part there, but I can't remember.
Uh, yeah, would they overlap with plants that bees use exclusive, or oh, are there certain plants that have features or deterrents that ward off wasps?
Well, there's plants that ward off pollinators generally, like
Okay.
milkweeds are one of them. They
Oh,
have certain kind of toxic substances in their nectar that only certain pollinator groups can visit, say like maybe the brown-belted bumblebee versus the common eastern bumblebee
oh,
can't consume that milkweed substance. So there's
okay.
like that generally, but I don't think that's particularly targeted at wasps. It would be somewhat difficult because of how closely related wasps are to bees.
Hmm.
That it'd have to be something like really specific to the whole group of bees.
Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Borchardt, I think that gets all of our questions. This was really a fascinating webinar. I was just really interesting and useful information. I learned something about WASP that I'll be telling my children tonight. So thank you so much for the webinar. Well, telling lots of people about today. Thank you so much for the webinar and your work. Again, if you're on and need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker at alenaw@istate.edu by 5 o'clock today and include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. With that, please tune in next week to hear a little bit about um, thinking about adoption of practice or using data to understand farmers' sustainability journey. And with that, Kate, really thank you for your webinar today and participation with the Our Learning Farms Conservation webinar series.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yep.